You ready to get started, John?
Yeah, we can get started. Um, so just to cover a few housekeeping items before we kick it off, is just so you're aware, you'll be started out as muted, and then we'll open it up as we get into the presentation and into the discussion section. Also, the meeting will be recorded, so it'll be part of the public record. All the other meetings were recorded as well, so it'll aid us in taking minutes as well as be available to the public for viewing at a later time. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Nelson, our planning commissioner and subcommittee member.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Nelson. On behalf of the City of Dana Point, I want to welcome you to the stakeholder meeting and express our appreciation today for your input, not only today, but throughout this process. As I said, my name is Eric Nelson. I serve as our vice chair to the city's planning commission, as well as on the subcommittee. And before we get started, I did want to take a minute to introduce the team or the subcommittee. So joining us today is Planning Commissioner Roy Donor, Community Development Director Brenda Wisniewski, Senior Planner John Chiampa, and Community Development Manager Jeff Rossler. And given that we've got a small group today, I'd love to just go around the room and have you self-introduce yourself and tell us, because today's group, I believe this is the stakeholder that represent the groups within the city. Would love to hear what group you're representing or that you're affiliated with, and I'll just call your name based on what I see on the screen here. So first up, I'd call on Karen.
Hi, my name is Karen Morris. I work with John Russell at the Capistrano Bay Community Services District.
Great, thanks, Karen. And Barbara. Oh, and you have to unmute yourself as well.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I am just a very concerned resident of Dana Point about short-term rentals in our neighborhood and how that's going to change our neighborhood. And we just, I was involved with the referendum in 2016 where we had about 4,000 signatures on the referendum to try to change the ordinance or stop the ordinance that had been, that was attempted prior to this. So we just are super concerned about this and would very much like your input. Thank you. And
great, thank you. Next up is Tony Nelson. And no relation, right, Tony? You and I aren't related that I'm aware of?
Unless you have some Canadian relatives somewhere, perhaps.
Oh, you betcha, eh?
Could be. Yeah. I'm with Capo Cares, founder of Capo Cares. So I'm very interested because Capo Beach is interested, because just like Lantern District, Capo and Lantern have a disproportionate share of short-term rentals, mainly because we do not have HOAs. And we're confused as to why the city is honoring the zoning within HOAs and their CC&Rs, but the rest of us are kind of being thrown to the wolves. So we're concerned. And I think all of Capo Beach and probably anyone who doesn't have an HOA is very concerned. So
great.
I want to hear what you're going to do to us. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Dawn, are you there? We can see your name, but I don't see a picture, Dawn, if you're there. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. And the last I could see is Enzo. If you can unmute and introduce yourself. Enzo, are you able to unmute and tell us give us an intro? All right. Well, hopefully we'll get that fixed. But in the meantime, I'm going to kick it over to Brenda, and Brenda can walk through. Okay, it looks like Enzo's mic's not working, so he said hi to everybody, and he'll be listening in. I'm going to kick it over to Brenda to take over for a few minutes.
Okay. Great. Thank you for joining us. We have joined together a series of stakeholders as yourselves to try to have some small group discussions to go through our process of looking at potential short-term rental program. So first, I want to give you a little bit of background, and we've developed a brief PowerPoint presentation that each of the staff members are going to be sorting through. And at the end of the presentations, we will have plenty of opportunity for discussion. So I'm going to ask John to bring up the presentation. He's sharing the screen with us all. And what we want to start with, and many of you sound like you already know the history behind short-term rentals in the community. They have historically been part of our infrastructure, but we haven't had an ordinance in place with the exception of some business regulations in our municipal code. The city did approve an ordinance in 2016, but as was mentioned by Barbara, that was rescinded as a result of a petition based upon concerns from the community of what short-term rentals and that they might not be compatible or be our character of our community. So the council at that point said, okay, we're going to continue to allow our existing short-term rental permits to remain. In the meantime, we're going to try to develop an ordinance and adopt that ordinance. So at that time, there's about 165 permits that were in place. Today, there's 142. So Jeff Rossler will go over a little bit about the status of those permits and our enforcement efforts. So going on, since 2016, the city council did develop a subcommittee that the next slide shows. And so the subcommittee is comprised of 2 council members. And those council members did somewhat similar to what we're doing now, of going out into the community, speaking with the California Coastal Commission, who does have a role in us regulating short-term rentals. We have to include our regulations in our local coastal program. So the Coastal Commission is seeking to ensure that we allow short-term rentals in some capacity, in that they are considered to improve coastal access to the coast. Another element of the past few years of efforts were 2 surveys. There were actually 2 surveys that were done. The most extensive was done probably about a year ago, and the conclusions of that survey are available on our city's website. And some of our, what is a BMP? BMP is best management practices. So Tony's asking the number 2 there. Basically what the subcommittee was doing is like just look at what other cities were doing and finding out what best practices we can integrate into our program. And that again is what we're doing today. So going on to the next slide. So what we have done is as part of the previous subcommittee efforts with the council, as mentioned, talking with the Coastal Commission. And we're trying to explain ourselves to the Coastal Commission, the conundrum we have of Coastal Commission wants us to have a program, but our community is concerned about what the program looks like. And we didn't want to go down a path of creating a program based on what the Coastal Commission staff is telling us and have it not be successful with our community itself. So the idea came up of developing a pilot program. And what that allows us to do is develop a program that allows us to adjust that program over time without it actually being formally approved as an ordinance. So that's what we're at now. What the City Council did in June of 2020, next slide shows, is that they directed staff to work with the Planning Commission to help develop the pilot program. What they said is go out into the community, give as much input as you can, and develop a pilot program that includes an assessment of all types of short-term rentals, meaning not only home stays, but also the typical short-term rentals. And a second component of that is develop a robust enforcement program, in that if we're going to have short-term rentals in our community, let's ensure that we have proper regulations and enforcement tools in place. And that is really where we are today. And that's the purpose of this call, is to really focus and get your input on, if we have short-term rentals in our community, what type of enforcement mechanisms should we have to really ensure that those meet our needs and can be good neighbors within our community. So the Planning Commission has been tasked with this. And so we have a subcommittee of the Planning Commission that was introduced today. And the next slide, I think, goes over our next the phase approach we're taking with this effort. So I'm going to ask John Champa to go over that.
There we go, unmuted now. So essentially to move forward with the City Council direction, as Brenda had laid out, the city's identified a 2-phased approach to accomplish that. And the first phase would be to look at the existing short-term rentals and consider modified regulations to ensure compatibility with the neighborhood. So based on past public outreach, including the surveys, key issues and concerns identified by the community were parking, noise, and trash. So that's been some level of focus for us in looking at and evaluating new potential regulations to incorporate. Phase 2, as Brenda had identified, it would be the temporary short-term rental pilot program. So this would be for the consideration of issuing potentially new permits, and that would be for the consideration of all types of short-term rentals in the discussion and the evaluation through public outreach, as well as enhanced regulations and best management practices. So the standards and regulations that would be developed as part of the pilot program would be guided by the input from the public through these efforts. And then, as Brenda had also mentioned, the pilot program would allow for some flexibility to refine the regulations over time if necessary, to ensure that if a regulation needed to be modified or tweaked, we could do that without a lengthy amendment process and make a quick adjustment to those. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Community Development Manager, Jeff Rossler, who will go over code enforcement.
Good afternoon. As John, Brenda, and Eric already mentioned, we had a permitting process in place for new short-term rentals for almost 2 years, beginning in 2016. When the referendum petition happened, we were no longer permitting new short-term rentals, but we were renewing the short-term rentals that were already permitted. So I'd like to look at some of the nuisances that have occurred and some of the code cases that have occurred in the past 5 years, of these already existing permitted STRs. You'll see here that here's a map of the distribution of short-term rentals in town, and it's overlaid with a version of the voting districts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You can also see the city limit there, as well as the coastal zone of the city of Dana Point. In looking at the map, you see a large concentration of homes with short-term rental permits on Beach Road, which is in District 5, voting District 5. And also, it's worth pointing out that there's 14% in Capitol Beach itself. District 1, which accounts for 20%, is the Bible Belt District, and District 4 is the Lantern District with 31%. Districts 2 and 3 comprise the remainder. So this is looking at short-term rental permits over time, and you can see that in 2016, when we first started, we had 165 permits submit TOT. That number of permits has decreased through time through attrition. You cannot, once you have the permit does not stay with the property, it stays with the owner. And so if you sell your property or you choose not to renew your permit, the permit expires. As of today, Brenda and I were talking earlier, I think we are at 141 permits. So that is the new number for today. You can see that TOT, although permit numbers have decreased, TOT collected by the city, at least in 2018 and 2019, has increased. We don't quite have the numbers for 2020 yet. So this is looking at code cases. And so these are cases where our code officer has gone out and either explored the internet looking for advertisements, or has gotten a nuisance complaint and has gone out to verify the nuisance. There are 3 types of code enforcement cases that we keep track of. We keep track of advertising for short-term rentals without a permit, and you can see that that's the largest number of code cases that we do annually. And then late TOT, so we're out there reminding those with permits to submit their TOT. And then nuisance down there in the gray is the smallest amount of code cases that we do, but probably the ones that affect the community the most. So this gets into those nuisance code cases, at least for 2020. John, can you go back one slide, do you mind? I just want to point out that although nuisance are a small portion, you can see that they've kind of gone up in number from 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. We actually had the most nuisance reports or code cases in 2020 than all other years, even though 2020 probably had limited number of STR visits due to COVID-19. We did have the most number of nuisance complaints during that year. So these nuisance complaints come in through our 24/7 hotline. That hotline is managed by a third-party vendor called Host Compliance. We received 67 total number of calls into that hotline, but only 28 of those calls were for actual nuisance. And I believe all but 2 were for noise, maybe 1 for parking and 1 for trash. Code enforcement went out and investigated all of these complaints, and they found 4 of them to be valid, and those valid complaints immediately got citations. So you'll see 4 citations were issued for STR nuisance, those who had permits, and they were all for excessive noise. Interestingly enough, these complaints, 3 of the citations went to the same property, and 1 went to a property on Silver Lantern that no longer has an STR permit. So out of the 146 properties we had last year, 144 of those properties didn't receive any citations, whereas 2 properties received citations and 1 of the properties with 3 of those citations. Also at the top there, you can see how our complaint numbers or our nuisance calls certainly go up during the summer months, with the winter months not logging any complaints. So those are kind of the nuisance numbers that I wanted to point out as we move forward and we talk about updating the ordinance to really concentrate on noise, trash, and parking, so that it's more effective for code enforcement out there in the field.
John.
Hey, John, you're muted. I think one of the most common phrases we all heard last year, probably this year, is you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
All right, so I'm gonna hop in and go over the existing, some of the key existing short-term regulations, as well as some additional regulations that we've, come across from other municipalities that we feel like may be appropriate in aiding code enforcement in some of the enforcement measures, as well as just ensuring with neighborhood compatibility for these uses. So with that, one of the key concerns based on public input over the years has been parking. So our current regulations require 1 parking space per bedroom with a maximum of 2 parking spaces. However, the director could approve additional parking spaces depending on the site conditions. Additional regulations for consideration, the staff has identified is designating a public nuisance if any vehicles for guests or short-term renters or their visitors are parked on the street. Additionally, the property owner would be responsible to pay all parking penalties incurred by the renters. Next is noise. So our current regulations require that the owner to ensure that the tenants don't create unreasonable noise disturbances or disorderly conduct. If they are brought to the attention of the owner, then the owner is to abate the disturbances, including contacting the tenant, calling the law enforcement, code enforcement, or even escalating it to evicting the tenant or other methods necessary. Additionally, they should take action to prevent a reoccurrence within a 24-hour period. Some of the additional items that staff has identified from other municipalities that they have incorporated in their short-term rental ordinances is that no amplified noise should be heard at the property line at any time of day. And then in addition to that, that no amplified noise, including talking, acoustical music, or any other noises should not be heard at the property line between the hours of 10 p.m. and 10 a.m. And then the last key regulation that's been identified is trash. So our current regulations require trash containers to be only visible between from 5 p.m. the day prior to trash pickup, and then must be removed at 8 a.m. the day following collection. Additionally, the owner should provide sufficient trash collection, depending on the number of attendees at the property. Additional regulations for consideration are that any units with 3 or more bedrooms should be providing at least 2 90-gallon waste containers, and then designate a nuisance if the trash containers are left out past the designated period, as well as if trash is strewn throughout the site or not located within the containers. It would be a nuisance violation. So with that, we are also looking for your input on not only those regulations, but any additional regulations or issues that you feel like is necessary to incorporate. Right now, we're really working towards phase 1. So any comments associated with how we can address additional regulations for the existing short-term rentals is preferred at this time. So with that, our next steps is this is actually our last stakeholder meeting. So this is the last meeting of those. And then next we will have a planning commission briefing, which will be on Monday, January 25th, which will provide an update in terms of the progress of the subcommittee, as well as a brief summary of the stakeholder meetings. So then the next opportunity for public participation will be a planning commission workshop, which will be on February 22nd. And with that, it will be, we will be taking provisions to ensure that everyone can participate. We'll be hosting it likely via Microsoft Teams to allow for people to either participate in person at the city council chambers for the planning commission meeting, or via Microsoft Teams, so that we can get participation and hear from everyone. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to get some of your comments and input.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate that. And I know, Tony, you've got a couple questions that you typed out, but since you've been interacting, maybe you could jump in and just we take these live, and Brenda might have to answer some of these.
I have a bunch of questions, so you might want to just take some of mine and then circle back to me later so I don't dominate. But yeah, my question was about the permits themselves. So we had 156 or something, and now we're 142. What I'm concerned about is, are some of these permits inactive just because it's COVID and they haven't had any renters and you're just going to reinstate them later? Or once they have become inactive, is that a permanent state?
So by inactive, I'm assuming that you're defining that as a permit that is not being rented, correct?
Well, you just said that several we had 160 and it's now 142, and some of them became inactive. Did they become inactive because they stopped renting and then they'll just restart renting again? Or are they inactive because they lost their permit?
I'm not sure the term inactive that was used, but the ones that did fall off, we only have 141 permits today. The ones that fell off from the original, they have fallen off for various reasons. Some because the property was sold, some because they chose not to renew. Jeff, you can address if there's any other categories, but those individuals are not eligible to have those reissued.
Yeah, that's correct. There is no provision that inactive permits lose their permit status, but the permit holders need to annually renew, and some have chosen not to do so. And then, like Brenda said, if you sell your property, the permit does not stay with the property, that permit is no longer valid.
So Jeff, could you clarify how many, I'm getting feedback. I'm not sure. Maybe there's too many mics on. Can you guys
There you
hear?
go.
Okay. Jeff, can you then clarify for us exactly how many permits are still out there that could become active if they reactivate themselves? Because I know the city regularly writes to them and says, hey, do you want to renew your permit? So if I have one and I just don't operate this year, can I start it up again next year? How many are those?
There is, as of today, 141 permits in the city.
Okay. Sorry, that's kind of a semantic thing. Okay. First real question is, you were referring to all these stakeholder meetings, and 2 groups really seem to be missing. And I've already written to you about the rental group. I think that's a huge constituency. I became aware just recently that 55% of the the residents in Lantern District are renters. And it's something like 38% in Capo Beach. I mean, all of these people are long-term renters. So if there's a potential for some of those to be turned into short-term rentals, which is way more lucrative, and I get it, that's what business people want to do. They are a big stakeholder constituency, and I'd really like to ask that they be considered. And I also think that it's really important to reach out to our Hispanic community, because a lot of them have no clue what's going on at City Hall. They're not going to be involved. They're not going to know anything's happening until their landlord boots them and turns their apartment building into short-term rentals. So I'd hate to see that happen, because we have a big housing shortage. We've got people just on the verge of homelessness, and it seems a mixed message for the city. So that's the number one group. And the number two group I'm concerned about is hotels. We have all of these hotels that contribute so much that they pay for, our entire police services. And we have a bunch of new ones coming. We have Seaside Inn just down the street from me that's going to, contribute another 30 rooms or something. We've got that Wave Hotel, the Green Lantern Hotel. I think there's 3 more big ones coming in. They have a stake in this, because these are competitors with our primary bread and butter industry. So I'd really like to see the hotel industry consulted on what we're trying to do here. So just your feedback on that. Do you have any intention of including these groups or no?
I'll be happy to address that. So at the get-go with the subcommittee and staff, we were brainstorming about how can we best be effective in reaching the community during this strange time that we're in, and how can we ensure that we have not only various opportunities but different formats, and how can we reach different pockets of the population. So that's why we have started off with, we developed an outreach plan that is fairly comprehensive, utilizing different ways of getting out the message out to the community, using social media, press releases. Each planning commission meeting, we are having this as an agenda item so that anybody watching the meeting can participate. And then so down to the meetings themselves, we wanted to ensure we had the opportunity to have small group discussions like this, but also a broader discussion as we're going to be having on February 22nd. And we're not going to be limiting it in any way. The stakeholders that we have identified, the groups we identified, was based upon the groups that we saw that have already come out and spoke regarding this issue. Kind of creating, based on the interested parties we've seen, how can we group them together in a way that makes sense? If we see a group of renters that makes sense to bring them together in a formal fashion, have a stakeholder discussion, we are certainly open to that. Because as you see, this type of forum actually is pretty easy for just to jump on a call for an hour and have a great discussion. So we're not shortchanging at all. The biggest challenge I think we have is just trying to get the message out and getting people aware of it. So I think right now what we've seen is social media is pretty effective. So over the next 4 weeks, Jeff Rossler actually is developing a comprehensive messaging that's going to be happening, I think, on even like every few days or maybe a once a week situation, where before the February 22nd meeting, social media things will pop up, as well as we have an opportunity with Dana Point Times to put something in the paper there. So, and also people like you as ambassadors to this issue, trying to spread the word. So just as to say, like, we're not trying to limit things in any way. We have created this program of reaching the community, and it's certainly evolving as we see the need.
Is there any interest in sending a notice to all residents of Dana Point? I mean, or even just to the 4,000 who signed the referendum, or even just to the Hispanic community in Spanish? I mean, there are so many people, Brenda, who never look at what's going on at City Hall. There are people across Dana Point who have no idea we have districts. They don't know what planning commissioners are. They don't even know what STR means. And we could be out on social media, but they don't have computers. I get
that, definitely. So you're thinking that a mail out would be more effective than something that they might get on their phone?
Well, a phone, if you have their phone numbers.
Well, I
you
mean,
know?
by social media, I'm saying. Most people are just so connected to their
Yeah,
phone.
I understand that, but there's a whole culture out there that doesn't have phones, that doesn't use, there's so many elderly people too that don't use social media. I have people in Capital Cares that will only talk to me by telephone because they don't use Facebook and they don't use Nextdoor and they don't have any of those things. So I just want to make sure everyone's included because you're talking about changing our neighborhoods. And it's, I know you just think, oh, it's just businesses coming into, we're just expanding this STR thing. And I get it. My family invests in real estate as well. I get there's tons of money to be made. I get that there's big developer interest in Dana Point and big real estate interest, and it's very lucrative. But at the same time, we're talking about our neighborhoods where we live. And nobody opposes people making money on short-term rentals, but do it where it belongs. Do it in, business districts, commercial districts, mixed-use districts. You don't have to come into our neighborhoods because not only does, it might be a plus for me because I set up my short-term rental, but it's terrible for my neighbor who didn't really count on having a hotel next door. And I don't know, Barbara maybe can chime in on this because she's a real estate agent. But I think it's a big negative to your property value and ultimately to the city's property tax if we allow short-term rentals throughout Dana Point.
Well, I just want to make sure too, Tony, and appreciate your comments. I think they're valid. Nothing that we are doing right now is planning on how we're addressing the STRs in the future. Today's meeting is to discuss our regulations that we currently have in an attempt to give Jeff and his team the ability to enforce the law. But right now we're having some challenges, frankly, with the way they're set up, that they don't have the teeth that we think they need. In our second phase, which you'll be included in that, is when we're going to talk about the realities of STRs and where they belong. Do they belong? What neighborhoods do they belong in? We know that the Coastal Commission is going to make us include them somewhere, and where that ends up being, we don't know. I don't know where that's going to be. I know Roy doesn't know, Brenda doesn't know, and we're going to look to the community to help guide that discussion. But right now, we have no plans for STRs or expanding them. Frankly, they may, go south. We aren't the decision makers. We're part of the decision-making process, but we are doing that in our second phase, and that's not what today is focused on. Today, we really want to talk about what are the things that haven't worked and what are the things that we can do to ensure that whatever we end up with has the regulatory environment that makes it impossible for those owners who don't take care of their property and create nuisances in our neighborhoods, that we can actually go after them and revoke their permits.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Eric. My only issue is that, okay, we're focusing on parking and trash and parties and so on, but you're ignoring, the big elephant in the room. The big elephant in the room is that there's a mini hotel in my neighborhood. And instead of having a neighbor, I've got a business use next door. And so
yeah, I hear you. And I think, I think the idea that we're ignoring it, it's probably it's not really what we're doing.
Okay.
Ignoring it means we wouldn't have another process ahead of us where we're going to sit down again with all of the stakeholders. And I think your idea of including the renters is a great one, to have that discussion. What do they want in their neighborhoods? Where do these belong? We're not avoiding that conversation. We're going to go direct. We're making this super easy for us as a group and for a community to really stay focused on the issue.
Okay, I just encourage you in all of your communication to make it really clear that there is no plan, definitely, to expand STRs in neighborhoods, because everyone who read your thing kind of interpreted it that way, because you're talking about, let's beef up the regulations and then we're going to slip them in with this 3-year pilot program. And I'm sorry, we just don't trust the process. We've had a 7-year pilot program already. Now you're going to add more in 3 years. And then what are you going to do? Grandfather those when we do a referendum, and then we'll have 300 STRs? I mean, I'm sorry, there's a trust issue here, and no offense, it has nothing to do with any of the people on this thing.
Yeah, no,
We're
we
talking
totally
about our
understand.
homes, and people are very passionate about it and very angry. So just be aware.
Yeah.
You're talking about our homes, okay? And we
Well,
don't live in HOAs, and we feel like we have a target on our backs. So
Well said. And I
want
think
to make that
what
clear.
our
Okay.
plan here was really to try to build that trust with you guys, with the community. That's why we're here today.
Okay. I'll take you at your word. Thank you.
You got it. All right. And anybody feel free to jump in. We certainly want some of your feedback. Barbara, please. You want to unmute yourself there? Oh, we can't hear you, Barbara.
Okay, is that it?
There you go.
Am I
Yep. Okay.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Well, one of the main questions I have is why now? I was just listening to the council meeting where Mr. Killebrew stated there was a discussion about the strategic plan for the city. And he talked about how difficult it is to do anything right now with COVID. You're short on employees, you're short on a lot of things that would need to be considered. And why are we doing this now when this is probably the most prime issue that's going to be addressed as far as neighborhoods are concerned in the city? And I'm just so upset that this is the time that you're rushing through this thing. You could wait till everybody's got their vaccine, maybe 6 months from now, and then bring this up when people can come in and do a discussion. When there was the 2016 referendum, there were multiple people talking about the problems that they're enduring as neighbors of short-term rentals. And I don't know where your code enforcement fella gets, that there's hardly any problems. There are major problems in numerous areas. And it's something that, there needs to be more than just Zoom meeting people talking about the issues that are involved here. And, I think this meeting is an example. There's 4, maybe 6 people discussing something that's going to change our real estate values, our enjoyment of our homes, our safety issues, and so many more things that it's a wrong time to be pushing towards anything in terms of what you're going to be putting through in any type of ordinance. And it really is concerning to me and a lot of people. And they've used in listening to council, they're talking about our budget issues, and that STRs may be something that would be very useful in bringing up funds. But in the last 3 years, there was about 122,000 of unpaid TOT and fines, and about 80% of those had not been collected. And when you figure, there is just not the, I don't know if it's the will or the staff or the know-how or what it is, why this system has not worked in our city. And the hotels are going to be the ones to pay the brunt of it when that's the assurance that you're going to be getting TOT. And then you're going to be taking funds out of their pockets by putting a major short-term rental program within the city. And getting back to the Coastal Commission, saying that there's, some requirements for Coastal Commission in wanting to bring visitors to the city. We're all for visitors to the city, but with the hotels that are coming in and the possibilities of putting short-term rentals in mixed use and in commercial areas, that's what needs to be thought about, and not putting them in neighborhoods. If you're going to put them in neighborhoods, why even have zoning? We have zoning to protect our neighborhoods. That was not something when we bought our homes that was even allowed. And now you're changing something or attempting to change a right of us owners to enjoy our homes without having a business next door. So there's multiple things, but I'm just wondering, all of the things that are going into your thought process on this. And I'll bring up one more thing that is very concerning is that why is our city attempting to expand the short-term rental program when you've got cities all over the nation trying to stop it? We have in Santa Monica, they put an ordinance through that would keep it as homestays and commercial areas. Same with Laguna, same with Santa Barbara, same with New York City. Laguna Niguel doesn't allow for them. San Juan has got a moratorium on them. So why is it that Dana Point is so hungry to put short-term rentals in when, in my opinion, it's been a failure. It's not a big money maker for us. And even if it was, what it will do to our neighborhoods is irreparable. And when you start putting ordinances in place and things, submitting to Coastal Commission and putting them in things that are not going to be able to be changed, to me, it's just the worst thing that can happen to our city and our neighborhood. So I hope you'll keep those things in mind and look to areas that are more acceptable, where you're not going to have neighborhoods that are designated R1 being affected. So that's what I'd like to say.
Great, thank you. I don't know if there are a lot of questions maybe in there, a lot of statements too. So is there a particular question you want us to answer?
Why has this, for number one, why now is it being so sought after to start this program right now when it's very difficult to be getting total community input?
Sure, Brenda, you want to jump in on that, or?
Yeah, I could try to address that. Well, first of all, as we know, this is an issue that we've been trying to develop an ordinance for quite some time. So this direction to develop a pilot program came about of June of last year. I don't think any of us would have expected that we're still in this situation. But that being said, I think we are making, and the world is making the best of the situation where we're having these Zoom meetings that in some cases we've had better turnout and better involvement than we would have if we had some person-to-person meetings. Yes, in this forum right now we have 4 people, but some of our other stakeholder meetings we had significantly more. So that being said, we are not rushing this through. And knowing that we're in this precarious situation, we are really trying to take a very thoughtful approach, ensuring that we're hearing from all parties. There's no rush to get this done, so that we have outlined a program that might come up with a program perhaps by the end of this year, but there's no time frame to ensure that we actually get it right. One thing I want to make sure too that you know is we're not expanding upon this program necessarily. As Eric mentioned, we might decide to do status quo. We might decide, or the city might decide to maintain the same number. There's not a determined factor that this will be an expansion of this program. This is all open for discussion. Today, what we wanted to hear and what we've been successful in hearing from other folks is, if a short-term rental was in your community, what would you want to see related to how to control noise, traffic, parking, occupancy? So some of the things we've been hearing from people are, perhaps there's a regulation that's in place that if they have 2 or 3 violations, that the permit would be revoked, or that we would place noise monitors in their units to ensure that the noise levels are monitored, or having a local contact, so that if you had a short-term rental next to you and you hear that there's issues that are occurring, you don't have to call the city, you don't have to sit there being frustrated or call the sheriff's department. You can call someone who's within, say, a 20-minute drive or 10-minute drive to have it addressed immediately. So those are the kind of thoughts we're trying to get from the community at this point of, if you have these type of uses in your community, what type of things should be put in place to ensure that they are good neighbors?
I have a comment. I wanted to say, as a positive for code enforcement that we saw this past summer, I didn't personally see them, but I heard that code enforcement was coming onto Beach Road towards the evening time, when typically we would have parties or overcrowding. I was just really impressed that they were taking the time, they were driving slow, they were really trying to listen. The only addition to having somebody do that on a regular basis, especially during summertime, is for whoever comes onto Beach Road to stop at the guardhouse, because they're typically the ones that hear what's going on, and they could give insight to whoever the code enforcement officer was when they came onto the road that day. So I was super impressed with that. I would love to see more of that, especially when we have high vacation seasons. So that was just a really positive thing for code enforcement. So the other side of that is we on Beach Road have some rentals that are non-permitted, and the fines that they get, I hear these homeowners saying, oh, it's not that big of a fine, so I'm going to stay illegal and just pay the fine and keep going. So I would like to see a stiffer fine that would really hurt their pocketbooks and make them stop, until at such point something changes. So, because it's very hard when you're renting the rental the way you should and you're paying your TOT tax to see a neighbor completely ignoring the rules. So, thank you.
Thank you,
But
Karen.
Jeff
That was
wanted to
good
maybe-
feedback. I don't know, Jeff, did you want to follow up on anything there?
Yeah, I'd love to, Eric. Karen, thank you for that. So, city management, Brenda, the city manager, wanted to have code enforcement out there to see what was really going on during the high use times. And we developed a small program. It was for the majority of summer, carried into September, October a little bit. We were out there on Friday, Saturday nights from about 6 till after 10, after the noise, so 10:30, 11. And it was successful. We approached a handful of STR visitors. We had some noise complaints on one property that went away after we made those approaches. And I know the guys did contact the gate, both at Beach Road and at Corniche, which is another HOA that has a high majority of, or a high population of STRs. And they found, contacting the personnel down there very helpful as well. So hopefully this is something that can continue in the future. The guys were getting paid overtime to work nights and weekends, so it's a kind of a funding thing, but it seemed to be effective. So I appreciate your comments there. As far as fines go, two things that we have been trying to root out those folks who are doing illegal STRs on Beach Road, and we've been successful. We've had public hearings on a couple of them. And I know there's some websites they're using that are kind of off our radar and host compliance's radar, but for the most part, we're having success getting them off Airbnb, VRBO, those sort of things. Our maximum fine level for a general law city is $1,000. We cannot institute a fine right now over that because that's governed by the California State Code. City Council agenda this week, City Council supported a Senate bill that hopefully will be going forward this year in the California State Senate that would potentially raise that to $5,000 specifically for STR and nuisance. So we wrote a letter of support. We hope that the Senate pushes that through, and we would support increased fines moving forward. And something else we've done, and not too many folks know, about 2 years ago, we were having issues collecting some of those fines. And we instituted a third-party contractor to go after those fines for us. And it's Data Processing Center, and they're the same folks that go after you when you get parking tickets. And so they'll put you in collections if you don't pay. They'll follow up with notices automatically. And they will even go to the Franchise Tax Board and get money from the state. So that's in play, and that has increased our revenue collection significantly in the past year.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And we have till 5:30, so this is an open dialogue. Anybody that's on, you're free to jump in, and if you have other thoughts or other regulatory items that you want to discuss, and some of the things that may be helpful from a code enforcement perspective, we'd love to hear those ideas.
Yeah,
Barbara, go ahead. Yeah, just feel free to just start talking.
There was, oh, Tony, are you talking? Okay. When we were talking about the STR issue in homeowners association, we felt, well, they're protected from having less than 30-day rentals. And we felt like, gosh, we don't have part of a homeowners association to protect us, and feel like there's not exactly parity there, why they are able to protect themselves, but we are not able to protect ourselves. The other question I have is just the opposite. In Miguel Beach Terrace, you're probably familiar in your Selva, there are so many short-term rentals there, and people are complaining all the time. And my understanding of what they're told by code enforcement is that's your homeowners association your responsibility. So I was wondering, how do you work with homeowners associations to actually enforce the short-term rental requirements? Because just because you're in a homeowners association shouldn't mean that you're not affected by city requirements. So can you answer that?
Yeah, Jeff, I think you probably be the best, but what I can tell you, at least what the conversations we've had to date is HOAs, can certainly add to the legality of what they're allowed to do, but does not give them the authority to circumvent the city code. So you can't do something that's illegal in the city just because you live in an HOA. As it relates to enforcement and Miguel Terrace specifically, Jeff, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, we send letters out, notice of violations, fines, citations to Miguel Beach Terrace all the time. So Ted Harris spent a lot of time boots on the ground, kind of rooting out where those illegal short-term rentals were in that area, and we've had I'd say a lot of success in getting those illegal STRs to stop.
But what about the the behavior? The people living there are still having to live with the problem. So that's the problem with enforcement. You can send out letters and you can contact owners, but if they don't want to do something, the neighbors are the ones paying the price, and that is the issue right there. I don't even see a code enforcement possibility of making neighbors whole in this situation. They're going to be the ones suffering, while the STR owner is the one bringing in the money. And unless you spend a lot of money having 24/7 enforcement and really very high penalties and closing them down, taking their licenses away, right away, I just don't see how you're going to be able to make this anywhere palatable by, in neighborhoods that, haven't had to live with this day in and day out. And with Airbnb, this is one of my big concerns. It seems that Airbnb just started selling, an IPO. Right now, they're worth about $100 billion. And they are hungry to be buying properties in areas where there is not a lot of problems in allowing STRs. And we're going to be one of them if you guys don't really sit down and put a location that is acceptable for the population here. And I really am very, very concerned. When we had our referendum in 2016, we sat right behind some Airbnb honchos, and they said, don't worry, we've got this. So you can't tell me that that group isn't having a lot of influence on our city in propelling this whole thing forward. And I'm very worried about, the whole spectrum there. So I just think it's so important that you give, residents a full chance to weigh in on this. And, the thing that we asked for was a vote. This is such a huge issue. And in the a city council meeting, 3 councilmen, it was put, Deborah and Paul had asked, proposed to have the residents be able to vote on whether an STR ordinance could be approved by the city residents, the voters. And Mueller, Victoric, and Federico said no. And to me, we're the population here. We're the residents. You are working for us. And at the very least, we should have a say in the ordinances that are going to be affecting our everyday lives. And I just cannot figure out why are you doing this without getting the approval of the majority of the people? And it just is, it's very bothersome to me. So would you answer? Could you talk on that?
Well, Barb, it's hard to talk on that specifically because you talked about a lot of different things. I think what I would say, and feel free, anybody on the subcommittee, to jump in, but as it relates to the challenges at the terrace, I believe those are all non-permitted. And so those are issues that are far surpass our capacity as a subcommittee, because these are people that are not following the law. They don't have permits. They don't have a right to operate in our city. And we should be taking every attempt to get rid of them that we can. And I believe that's the case. Jeff could certainly chime in on that, but we don't take those lightly, and we enforce our laws. And our laws say you can't have a STR without a permit. And I believe that's the case. As it relates to some of the other comments, I mean, you're here today because we want to hear from you. And the meetings that we have scheduled going forward is so that we can hear from the community. There's no, I live here. I'm a resident of Dana Point. I have a house. I have neighbors. I have the same types of concerns that you have. And as a commissioner, my job is to try to balance all that. But that doesn't mean just because we're here, I believe we should have more SDRs. I don't actually know what Roy's position is. And I'm not going to ask him because we're not here to talk about whether they're right or wrong. We're here to talk about what can we do to manage the impact of the existing STRs as we work through this process. And then down the road, we'll talk about whether we should be having STRs in our neighborhoods. So hopefully that answers your question. I mean, there was a lot in there, but, I'm an appointed official. I'm not elected. I'm not, as it relates to your comment about Airbnb, I haven't heard from Airbnb. I'm not sure if Roy's heard from them, but they have not been involved in this process. And frankly, I wouldn't welcome them into a room unless the entire community was there.
Good. Glad to hear that. That makes me feel better.
Eric, I would add to a couple of things. Number one, I think our objective is to look at what other cities are doing.
Looks like Roy froze up there.
Sometimes it helps to log out and go back in.
I'm not sure if he can hear us. Roy, if you want, jump out and jump back in. And maybe in the meantime, Jeff, can you confirm on Miguel Terrace issues? I mean, those are really, we're dealing with non-permit issues, right?
What are the implications?
Hey, Roy, we lost you from the beginning there, so apologize, but you have to kind of go back to the beginning. Your screen froze.
Okay. I guess I'll back up and say what I considered to be our objective was to take a look at the whole spectrum of short-term rentals. what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Should we have them? Should we expand it? Should we contract it? What are other cities doing that are successful? The platforms that people advertise on, some of the companies are saying, if you're not registered within the city legally, we're going to take you off the platform. So that's something that, how do we enforce that? That's something that is an educational process. I think from a gut level, I think you'd say there's a majority against short-term rentals in the city. Is that something that we should implement, saying we're not going to have them? Or should we look and say, we have some property owners that have short-term rentals that are owners and they want to generate some income. Mom has gone to long-term care and the family says, if we did some short-term rentals and controlled it well, then we can afford to have mom there. Should we eliminate the rights of a property owner for the majority, or do we protect some of the minorities? So those are the issues that I think, why now? The city council said, we want this planning commission to do a broad spectrum, analyze this, take a look at what best practices are, what are our problems, do we have are our regulations sufficient to manage what we have? And I think the survey that was taken said, no, we don't. We need to improve the regulations that we have so that we can analyze the negative impact on the neighborhoods. And I think, everybody that's part of this is a property owner in Dana Point. So we all have a combined mutual interest to get this right. And there is no push to make it, to expand it. I haven't been told that, but the question was, please analyze it and then let's educate everyone as to what the issues are before we go to another step. And phase one is, are our enforcement regulations adequate? And I think the answer was no. Then these meetings that we've had is, let's get suggestions from all the stakeholders of what we could do to make it better.
Tony, I think I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think a while back, Brenda had asked the question, what could we do to prevent some of these issues and problems with the homeowners, with the homeowners around the STRs? And I think the number one thing you could do is ask for supervision, because the problem is, you're running a business, you're running this little micro hotel, and unlike regular hotels, you don't have a front desk. There's nobody to call in the middle of the night when the parties start, right? So that's why I think most people in Dana Point would be absolutely fine with homestay STRs. There is no problem with that. If people have a casita or an ADU, or they even have a part of their house where they want to rent a couple of rooms, be our guest. Your home, you are impacted by the exact same nuisances as everybody else, all your neighbors, and you're going to be a good neighbor because you have to put up with it too, and you're not going to let them go crazy in the middle of the night. So, there is a compromise area there, and it's about supervision. And I'm sorry, no matter what code enforcement does, no matter what the police does, nobody's going to be there at 2 a.m. when the party starts. And you're just going to have angry residents around you. And nothing is going to mitigate the damage to the surrounding property owners who have to disclose that, oh, I have a short-term rental next door. I mean, would you have bought a house knowing that there was a full-time short-term rental? No, nobody wants to. We want to live in residential areas. So to my way of thinking, you can't have it. But by the same token, I understand that there's a long history of it, especially on Beach Road. That's part of our community. Some of them have done it, I think, since the 40s and 50s. So I get that. And you probably would open up the city to a bunch of lawsuits if you suddenly change that for those property owners. So I think whatever you do, even if you decide to stop short-term rentals within residential areas, it would be very smart to grandfather the existing ones and just have them disappear as the title changes. So when the properties are sold, that permit does not confer to the new owner. And that would be a fair way to do it, a fair way to deal with the existing ones. But for God's sakes, do not add to the problem and give us even more. Because as Jeff saw, you know, as he showed in his statistics, the number one complaint is an illegal STR. Well, right now we have 140. What happens when we have 300 and they're all over the city and you can't keep track of them? And for 300, you're going to have, you know, maybe 900 illegal ones. You'll never track them down. It'll just be a free for all. And nice Dana Point will become Party City. And we don't want that. We're a really nice town with really nice residential areas, with neighborhoods, with children, people who have a stake in the community, and we want to preserve that. So that, you know, we talk about, quote, property rights, and you're saying, you know, that the STR owners have property rights. Well, my understanding is that Dana Point has permissive zoning, that if it's not stated that something is allowed, it is understood that it is not allowed. So nowhere in our residential zoning does it say short-term rentals are okay. Rentals 30 days and more are okay. Under 30 days are in no way are legal. So there is no property right within our zoning. If you expand this program, you're talking about adding more, you're actually conferring property rights to short-term rental owners and not giving any respect to the people who might not want them there. You know, I mean, in a perfect world, you could say, you know, Mrs. X wants to open a short-term rental. Let's talk to all the 4 or 5 or 6 neighbors around her. If they're all in agreement, go for it, because they're the ones who are bothered. But no one's going to ask the neighbors. They're only going to give that right to the STR owner, and the rest of us are just chopped liver. We don't matter. And that's the problem. There's a basic unfairness. And I think any law should be fair. We need to treat everyone equally. And that's why people resent that HOA owners are almost given a privileged class, although as we can see in Niguel Beach Terrace, it certainly happens to them too. And we don't, you know, we're not jealous of them having it. I mean, God, if I could be in an HOA, I would over here, but I can't. By the same token, you're creating 2 classes of citizens. You're saying over here, we have property rights we're going to respect. And then these non-HOA people, you know, we're going to throw you to the dogs, and that's not okay. And the other issue you talk about is somebody said something about, or you did, I can't remember how it came up, but one factor to keep in mind is that a lot of our STRs are owned by investors, and 64% of those have nothing to do with Dana Point. They don't even live in Dana Point. So you're actually bending over backwards to please people who aren't even voters or citizens in our own town. They are pure investors, and they don't have a stake in our community. They just don't. They're here to make money, and that's perfectly legit. But please invest in mixed use or commercial areas. We have vacant lots where you could put up, you know, a 4-story building and have tons of STRs. You could take all of Prado West and turn it into STRs. You could take whatever it's called, South Cove across from Doheny. That could be STRs. And no one would object because they're commercial areas. People expect to have more noise. They expect, you know, commercial activities like restaurants and shops and so on. They should be allowed there. You're trying to force a business use into a residential area. And that's why every town in California is going the other way, and Dana Point is out of step. And, you know, the CCC is not going to force you to have short-term rentals in Dana Point. They were perfectly okay with a program for homestay only. And we all know that was in the public record. They were fine with it. And our council decided to change that and open it up to everything. So you're not going to sell us anybody on that one, because the CCC was perfectly fine with Laguna Beach. They were fine with having strictly homestay and commercial and mixed use areas. And that's what I'd love to see in Dana Point. We will all go away and leave you alone if you'll just do that. And even grandfather the ones you've got and do what you can to supervise them and control them and keep your code enforcement tight. And everyone will be happy. But please just think about this. You're going to have a big fight, and we just don't need it. We just don't need it here. So that's my soapbox, sorry. Sorry, one other thing about the actual enforcing the ones that we actually do have right now. We did a Public Records Act request, so we had a good look at all of the fines that came through. And one thing we noticed is that code enforcement tends to go like one day a week. Like it seemed like every Wednesday was the day they went out and checked out all the illegal short-term rentals. And although the code allows them to charge, $1,000 up to $1,000 every single day of the rental, they never did that. There was one up the street from me that was doing 4-day weekends. They got 1 fine. They didn't get 4 fines when they really have had 4 violations. And maybe I'm reading that wrong, but why not, charge it to the max? And then definitely on the collection and enforcing those penalties. To my knowledge, in 7 years, we have never had one STR that was where the permit was rescinded for cause or for non-payment of penalties. And we analyzed it. There was one guy there's 19 that were responsible for 71% of the fines. 19 people. If you got the legal department to go after those 19, you'd cut out, so many of the fines. Why aren't we doing that? And then 7 of them, only 7, accounted for $55,000 in unpaid penalties, 45% of the penalties. What the heck? Go after the 7 bad guys. Instead, every year we go, oh, we're wiping the slate clean. And instead of continuing to charge you and identify the bad actors, instead we're going to wipe it clean and let's warnings. Talk effective. It just doesn't work. And that's why, people just don't buy it that this is going to work. But yeah, there's opportunity to improve. And one last thing on the parking. You talked about, telling people that they can't have parking on the street for their visitors and so on. We've had that situation many times in Capo Beach. And what I'm told is that the police or code enforcement or whoever's called when no one can get out of their driveway because they're having a wedding in the short-term rental, they were told that you can't identify which car belongs to whom. The short-term rental people just go, oh, those aren't my visitors. Oh, that's not my car. Unless code enforcement is ready to pull the registration on all of them and ask everybody for ID in a police state, you're not going to be able to enforce that. The parking sounds great on paper, but in reality, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So that's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you. And Jeff, could you, as it relates to enforcement and fines, walk us through a little bit about how a $1,000 fine works?
Sure. Yeah, Tony, as part of all the data you got from the public records request, a lot of that data was, prior to being brought over into this department. And I think we made a lot of changes when I was brought in this department and when Brenda was brought into this department as well. I will admit that, yeah, at some point, we were just issuing citations for those people who are doing it illegally. And we didn't have a lot of follow-up. And, like I said, that's why we went out and hired that third-party vendor to follow up on it. And all those citations, except for 4 this past year, and I think it's even fewer in the past, are for people operating illegal short-term rentals. It's not for nuisance at short-term rentals. It's for illegal operation of short-term rentals. And absolutely, when I got hired, that was one of the first things we did was we started to fine people every day $1,000. And on Beach Road, that got them to stop rather quickly. And that we did that to 2 or 3 properties. And I must say, there's 1 property out there that's still advertising today. I just looked, for Barbara's sake, I just looked at how many properties we have in town through our third-party vendor who are operating illegally right this second. And it's 8. And of those 8, I couldn't verify 2 of them. So somewhere between 6 and 8. 3 are identified in Niguel Beach Terrace and 2 are on Beach Road. And the ones on Beach Road I know well. We've issued them citations in the past, and as Karen said, it is a game to them. They'll post it for a few days, get a couple renters, take it down, hope the city doesn't notice. If we do notice, we slap them with a fine. But most of the people in town aren't like that. And 8 out of, I don't know our housing stock right now, but 8 out of a lot of homes operating illegally is not a lot. And, we are certainly on it. And we do our best, and we are using the tools that we need to use to best do enforcement. And that's what we were supposed to be talking about today was looking at new tools that could increase our levels of enforcement, including parking, trash, and noise.
And do we fine by day or by occurrence on the fines?
We have the ability to do both. The code is written by day, and if it's a repeat offender and that repeat offender does not deserve any leniency, then we do it by day. But most of the people, Eric, you know, we keep stats on how many code enforcements go past a second notice, and this is getting out of STRs. But we only had 37 that needed repeat notices out of over 1,200 cases this year. So, you know, we're talking, you know, we keep focusing in on the very small percentage of folks who don't take responsibility when they get that letter from code enforcement and don't correct their actions.
Got it. Thank you.
You know,
We got to about 13 minutes. Roy, go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing that in talking to some of the operators, as Tony pointed out, it's in their economic interest to retain their permit. So many of the owners give their phone numbers to all of their neighbors, so that if there's any problem at 2 o'clock in the morning, the owner gets the call first, because most of the owners want to protect the right so it's an economic benefit to them. And if they know that with a number of violations, with the third violation, they could lose their permit totally. So I think there's some self protection or self regulations there that are possible if they are at jeopardy for losing a permit.
Roy, I think you're absolutely right. And I think most of the short-term rental owners that we have right now are pretty responsible. I know several in Capitol Beach who are very responsible owners. But here, you know, the million-dollar question is, even if you have a really terrific STR next door, you've got like the Ritz-Carlton of STRs, they're so good that everything's very nice and very calm, but still, every 2 or 3 days, you got new people coming in there and you don't have neighbors. I will tell you, 9 out of 10 times, if you ask the neighbors, would you prefer that your neighbor did not operate an STR? And they're going to say yes. So the STR by its essence is, you know, by its very nature is a nuisance. So I can't get past that. You know, we don't really want them next door. We don't want them hurting our property values. It's an inappropriate use in a residential area. And you're never going to convince most people that that's not the case. I get that they're great. A lot of them are great. I get it. And they're doing their best.
I don't think we're trying to convince people that they should necessarily be in a residential area. I think the question is, where should they be? Should we have them? And how many? Should we limit the percentage by neighborhood? Should we limit it by building? Those are the kind of questions that we're trying to wrestle with after we figure out, can we enforce what we have with the ones that we have? And what are the shortfalls that we have for the enforcement team to be able to enforce the rules that we have? And should we add some rules or some requirements?
Yeah, well said, Roy. Thank you. I think the bottom line is that a business use belongs in a business area. So if we go to these investors and say, hey, would you like to participate in Dana Point in these areas that are commercially zoned for businesses and set up STRs there, I think they'd be grateful to do it. They don't have to deal with angry homeowners. They don't, you know, it's a different environment. It's a commercial environment and people would be fine. Heck, I'd probably buy one myself in a commercial area, but I would never do that to my neighbors. But certainly if I'm in the middle of Lantern District or in the middle of a revitalized Doheny Village, and there's an opportunity to buy apartments and convert them to short-term rentals and serve our community, that makes absolute sense. That's a great way to make money. Everybody wins. So instead of fighting each other, I'm hoping that maybe we can come to some kind of solution. You know, I get that we'll have to grandfather what we've already got because it just wouldn't be fair to them at this point. But you know, why not just cut to the chase and do what would keep everybody happy? Allow opportunities for new improvement and new investment in short-term rentals, but just don't do it in our neighborhoods, and everyone will go home and be happy, honestly. So my 2 cents again.
Thank you. Well, with that, I don't see anybody else, wanted to chime in. But if you do, this would be your opportunity. We've got about 9 minutes left. We have a hard stop at 5:30 and want to make sure we don't leave anybody out. So feel free to just unmute and jump in if you have any further comments for us. All right. Well, seeing none, I really appreciate. It looks like Enzo unmuted.
Hi, Eric. Hi, everybody. Sorry I was late at the meeting. I jumped in about 4:30, so I missed the presentation at the beginning. I apologize for that. I listened to everyone, and it looks like everyone is against the STR. Now, I am not for or against. I do have several neighbors in my neighborhood that they do operate STR. As I've been in the Lambton district for about 4 years at the moment, I have not have any problem or heard any noises in my neighborhood. I trust that there is some nuisance, but I also know that there is a couple of my neighbors that they do that as a necessity because otherwise they could not afford to live in that neighborhood due to the parents pass away or whatever it might be. So I would like to see more of a, Jeff, I believe, is doing an incredible job to come to these houses and give warning and all that. I would like to see more, make sure that the laws on the books or the regulation, and I'm kind of new at these guys, so I'm just going to jump in all over, but I want to make sure that we apply what we have first before we completely take these STR out. I mean, I'm very concerned about property owner right. I know I live in a duplex and my son lives below me, but if my son gets married and goes somewhere and I don't want to lose my house, I could probably think about doing a rental below where I live. So my feeling is that we need to have much more of a broader view. Some people, I don't see any nuisance. I'm sure there are. I'm sure you all witness nuisance, but I have not. And I would love to hear more about nuisance specifically. And perhaps we can, Jeff can be a little harder on people, but you know, free country, guys. Let's.
Enzo, if I could ask you a question, your neighbors that you said own STRs and they're doing it to help, you know, pay for whatever for their family, do they actually live in the short-term rental that they are renting, or are they investors and they don't live there?
Tony, they live there. I am against personally for investors to live in Texas and buy a building and do STR. That I'm totally against. I think we need to be the local us living the neighborhood. I own a fourplex in Dana Point, and right now I have long-term tenants. But hey, if I want to put a bi-monthly people coming in town, Tony, I know that I travel a lot with my motorcycle and I go cross country and I use short-term rental all the time. I love it. I never had a problem. I just don't see the major opportunity.
I think, Enzo, that the situation that you describe is almost like homestay. You know, if you're in a duplex and you're renting the one next door, you have the opportunity to supervise what's going on in that short-term rental. It's very different than an investor-owned one. And, you know, you're talking about property rights, but there is no right in Dana Point for short-term rentals. There is nothing on the books that allows them. We have conditional permits. They've never been sanctioned by the Coastal Commission. There is no ordinance even. All of the ones we have right now have a sign, a notice on them that say that they are conditional. and we have allowed them for 7 years. So there's no such property right. It doesn't actually exist. They're talking about creating a new property right that will impact all of us. But I agree with you that if there are supervised short-term rentals, such as a duplex situation or an ADU or a casita, I don't think that's really an issue. It's the investors. And the thing is, right now, of those 140, by my math, there was something like 65% were investors. Sorry, it might be even a bigger number. I think it was, 72% are investors, and 64% of that number are out of town investors. So that's a very different situation. That is somebody who has no connection with Dana Point, owning a property next door to you and operating a mini hotel, and nobody likes it. It's just, I think we can all agree on that one.
I 100% agree with you, Tony, on that one.
Okay.
Kick them out.
Well, I hate to end this this dialogue. I really, on behalf again of the city, we appreciate you all taking the time to come out tonight and share your thoughts and your opinions, and look forward to this continuing in February, as well as the second phase, which I'm not sure I know when that is, or if we even have that set up yet. When we start to talk about the realities of where these belong, if they belong within the community, if they do, what they look like. But again, thank you for coming out, and please let your friends and neighbors know that we're in this process, and we want to hear from them as well.
Okay, we will. Thank
All
you.
right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for making the process, civil and open. And it's great to be able to explain some of our frustration and our passion about this issue. Because at the bottom line, we are all neighbors, and we're going to have to make some decisions and get together and agree on things. And there are many things that we can all agree on. And I'm glad to see that process. I think it's really important. We don't need fighting in Dana Point.
That's
We've
right.
had enough of that. We're kind of 2020
Amen.
is over. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that,
both.
Tony, and we appreciate that, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Good night, everybody.